Mesa is one of the most beloved Warframes in the game, but she has never been top tier at really high levels. However, these times are over now, because today I have for you a Mesa build that is so broken and busted beyond belief that you're going to be able to red crit your way through any content the game has to offer, all while at the same time being pretty much completely invincible. Shoutouts to all my generous channel members who help me keep the lights on, and let's jump right into it. Like with any other builds, let's first look at our kit, but this time we're gonna make it really short. First off, her passive doesn't matter for this build. Her first skill will be replaced by the helmet, so we're not gonna look at it either. Her 2 gives us more weapon damage and jams the weapons of nearby enemies, which is very cool. Her 3 gives us up to 95% damage reduction, which is incredible and makes Mesa one of the most tanky Warframes in the entire game. And her 4... well, I don't think I need to explain much here. It's the main part of her kit, we all love it, and we're gonna use it all day long. And that's already it for the skills. However, before we jump into the build itself, there's one more important thing that I definitely want to mention. This build today is quite complex with a lot of synergies and therefore needs a bit of explanation. So please bear with me, because if you skip over just one of the steps, it might be that the whole thing is not gonna work out anymore in the end. Thanks for your patience, but with that being said now, let's finally go. Starting out not with Mesa herself, but with her main weapons, the Regulators. We start out with Galvanized Diffusion to give us more multi-shot, which is pretty much the best multi-shot mod for this weapon. And then, since the crit stats are also good, we go for Prime Target Cracker and Prime Pistol Gambit for the chance and the crit damage. Then, to get more DPS, we add Anemic Agility and Lethal Torrent, both to add more fire rate, and also Lethal Torrent gives us a bit of multi-shot. Up next, just like any other weapon, we go for the element that we need for the faction that we're up against. So for Grineer, that would be Electricity and Pistol Pestilence for Corrosive. For Corpus, it would be Pure Toxin, and I personally would go for Heat against Infested. The final mod would be Galvanized Shot, giving us the base damage for this build and also a lot more status chance. And this is a bit interesting at this point, because with the base status chance of just 10%, it might raise questions why I go with the 60/60 mods for Corrosive and then Galvanized Shot to add even more status chance and do the base damage sort of in this way. See, the thing with the Regulators that sets them apart from all the other weapons in the game is they have infinite magazine size and they don't need to be reloaded. Therefore, we can get up to crazy amounts of fire rate, and with a very high fire rate, even a status chance of just 30% with a bit of multi-shot is more than enough to deal tons of status effects, and you're gonna see this later in the video. And speaking of fire rate, since the Regulators are basically Mesa's main weapon, what we want to do is make sure to buff the Regulators up as crazy as we can with all the rest of our kit. And that is exactly what we're gonna look at now. First off, as I was saying, having a very high fire rate will be our first aim of this build. And to start out with that, we're gonna look into our Mesa herself and pick the first arcane slot, which would be Arcane Velocity, giving us plus 120% fire rate to pistols whenever we score a critical hit, which is pretty much gonna be all the time, so this one is great. The next step would be our melee weapon, where we choose the Furax Wraith. Why the Furax Wraith? Well, because we have one special mod called Amalgam Furax Body Count, which is unique to this weapon, and as a second stat has plus 45% fire rate for secondary weapons, so when we put this one on, we're gonna get more fire rate for them. Next, we're gonna look at our companion, and in this slot we have to use Worm or Worm Prime. Why Worm? Well, because Worm is the only sentinel in the entire game with a high enough base shield that we could mod it to over 1200 if we use calculated redirection. Why do we want over 1200 shields? Well, pretty simple, because if we use the mod Reinforced Bond, this one gives us another plus 60% fire rate if our companion shields are over 1200. With all of this together, you know, the mods on the Regulators themselves, Arcane Velocity on Mesa, Amalgam Furax Body Count on the Furax Wraith, and Reinforced Bond on our Worm, we get to a total of plus 375% fire rate, which brings our Regulators to 70 bullets per second. This is absolutely insane, and I also see what I mean when I said 30% status chance is more than enough at that fire rate. Before we go on, as always, I would be super happy if you could maybe drop a like. Would help the video out a ton, so big thank you for that. And now let's look at how we can make our regulators even stronger. I promised you that we will red crit our way through Steel Path, and as it stands right now, our regulators are sitting at somewhat of 60-ish% crit chance. So let's change that. First of all, we go back into our Mesa and add Arcane Avenger. Arcane Avenger gives us plus 45% critical chance if we get damaged. However, what's important to note here is that these plus 45% are added at the end, meaning this is insanely strong. However, in order to trigger this Arcane, our health has to take damage. So what we also need to do with Arcane Avenger is adding Combat Discipline into our Aura mod, which will deal a little bit of health damage to us every time we kill an enemy. Now, the important thing here is that you want to have this one at rank 0, because at max rank you lose 10 health for every kill, and since we're going to kill a lot, this might actually get dangerous. This will be the first step of our crit buffing, but we're only getting started. Next, we look at our secondary weapon, where we're gonna use the Bronco or the Bronco Prime. We're gonna get to why here in a second. Let's first look at the build. In order to buff the crit chance of our regulators even more, we're gonna add an arcane called Secondary Outburst. What this does is, it sacrifices the current melee combo counter that you have and give you both crit chance and crit damage according to how high that was. Just as an example, if you have a 12x combo counter on your melee weapon, this one will give you plus 240% in both crit chance and crit damage for secondary weapons, which includes your regulators. Therefore, this one is a must on our secondary weapon. Next, we're gonna sit down in our helmet chair and add 4 Topaz Archon shards, giving us each and every single one plus 1% permanent crit rate to secondary weapons whenever we kill an enemy affected by heat damage. Now, I am aware that not every one of you will have 4 Topaz Archon shards, and that's completely fine. You could skip over this step if you want to, the build is going to be very strong anyway. And with all that crit chance being added, what we're now going to do as a last step is look back at our worm and upgrade it with the mod Tenacious Bond. What Tenacious Bond does is, if your companion has a crit rate of 50% or more, you are going to get a final 20% critical damage multiplier that is being added at the very end of the calculation, making this one very, very strong. And in order to make sure that our Sentinel does have 50% crit chance, we add the Volcax weapon and equip it with the mod Critical Delay. This will buff the whole crit chance up to 60%, and the effect of Tenacious Bond is on. Now, as I previously mentioned, on our secondary weapon we're using Secondary Outburst to transform our melee combo counter into crit damage and crit chance for secondary weapons. And this point right here is where the magic of this build starts happening. In the past, what you would want to do is use the Ceramic Dagger with the Incarnate Adapter as your melee weapon, because that had the ability to get you to a 9x combo multiplier. However, what if I told you that you don't have to keep it at 9x, but that you can actually get to a constant 12x combo multiplier that you cannot lose, all while at the same time not needing the Ceramic Dagger Incarnon and working with our Furex Wraith that we've chosen in this build. Looking back at the Furex Wraith, what we're gonna do is we add an arcane called Melee Crescendo. And the crazy thing that this does is, if you get a finisher kill, you get a certain amount of initial combo for the rest of the mission. In other words, if you get enough melee finisher kills, you can get your combo counter to a permanent 220, meaning a permanent 12 times melee combo multiplier. So, with Melee Crescendo now equipped, if we get enough melee finishers with our Furex Wraith, that will get our melee combo multiplier so high that the Secondary Outburst on our Bronco will make sure to always give us the plus 240% maximum value in crit chance and crit damage. Only question remaining would be, how in the world are we going to get enough finisher kills with a weapon like the Furex Wraith in order to even get this whole thing set up in the first place? And for that, we're going to look back at the Bronco. Just like the Furex, also the Bronco has a unique mod that only it and its Prime variant can equip, and that would be Dizzying Rounds. What this does is, if you hit an enemy from less than 8 meters away with this weapon, you automatically open them up for melee finishers. This one is tailor-made for this build because we simply need to shoot an enemy and then we can instantly melee finish them with the Furex Wraith. As for the rest of the Bronco build, we add quick draw and stunning speed to get more reload speed, which is nice. Then we're gonna add Scorch and Heated Charge to make sure we have a lot of heat on the weapon, which we need for our Topaz Archon shards, because remember, they only give us more crit chance if we kill an enemy affected by heat. Finally, we add Barrel Diffusion for more multi-shot, meaning more pellets that could theoretically inflict the heat, and Sure Shot to add more status chance, making it even more likely that we're gonna inflict heat. Last mod is pretty much up to personal preference. Also, we don't need an Exiles here. Let's now also take a look at how we're gonna build the rest of our Furax Wraith, which seems to be pretty empty by now, so let's change that. As it stands, absolutely doesn't matter at all, and the rest is gonna be pretty much a finisher build. Now, I know this might have been a lot to take in, and I agree this is kind of a bit inconvenient to set up once the mission starts, but I promise you, once you have all the buffs going, it's gonna be super convenient to play for pretty much the entirety of the mission you're running. So here's how you're gonna do it. Once the mission starts, the first thing you want to do is activate Mesa's third skill to make you pretty much unkillable. Then use your Bronco to hit the enemies and open them up for finishers, all while at the same time making sure that they're burning before you initiate the finisher, because remember, you need to kill enemies affected by heat to charge your Topaz Archon shards. Then, once the enemy is open for a finisher, use your Furax Wraith to get the finisher kill, and therefore build up your stacks for the melee crescendo arcane. Depending on the enemy faction and mission type, this might take 2 or 3 minutes to fully set it up to the maximum combo counter and also the maximum Topaz Archon charges, but once you have it done, you are set for the rest of the mission and don't need to pay attention to this anymore at all. But alright, so much for all the red crits and the damage output that we're going for. However, there is still a lot more to build. For example, our Mesa herself, so let's look into that next. First off, as with any Warframe build, what we're asking is, how do we keep the Warframe alive? The first layer of defense is of course her third skill, giving you up to 95% damage reduction, which is a ton. To reinforce that even more, we add adaptation, because both her third skill and adaptation don't only count on health, it also both counts on her shield. And speaking of shield tank, primed redirection is the next one that we're gonna throw onto her. Then we're gonna look back at our Archon shards over in the Helmet's chair, where we add a Tau Forged blue one to give us plus 225% shield capacity, which then means we're totaling around 8,000 shield points. That is very nice for 2 reasons. First off, if you're fighting normal steel path, enemies in the lower hundreds of level range, then with her third skill and adaptation, those 1,000 shields are gonna be very tanky, and that's gonna be enough to deal with those enemies already. And secondly, if you choose to go way higher in the enemy range, where the enemies start being in the thousands with their levels, then of course your shield is not going to be tanky enough anymore, but with 1,000 shield points, if the shield breaks, you get 2.3 long seconds of shield gating and vulnerability, and this is something that we're going to exploit even more with this little trick that I'm going to show you right now. Looking back at our worm, what we're gonna do is we give him the skill Guardian, which makes it that the moment your shields go down to 0, Worm is instantly gonna go and fill them up to the maximum again, which is a skill that has a 30-second cooldown. But if we use Manifold Bond onto the Sentinel, then whenever we kill an enemy that is affected by 3 or more unique status effects, the cooldown of abilities, aka of Guardian, is going to be reduced by 3 seconds. In other words, if we manage to kill 10 enemies within those 2.3 seconds, then Guardian is going to be up again, our shields are going to be refilled to the max again, we get another 2.3 seconds of shield gating and vulnerability, and so on and so forth, and with the Regulators rocking 70 bullets per second in fire rate, getting those 10 kills and all the status effects is going to be an absolute no-brainer. And to round up our entire defenses, we add Rolling Guard to give us a little panic button in case something goes wrong or maybe our Sentinel dies during the mission, which goes perfectly hand in hand with Mesa's Waltz in the Excel slot, which allows us to not only move but also roll while being in her Regulator form. So much for the survivability part of the Mesa build. Next, we're going to talk about how we manage our energy. And to do that, first off, we use WarframeFlo to get this over 500, which is a very nice value for maximum energy. Then we use Equilibrium as our method of energy sustain, and combine that, of course, with our Sentinel having Synth Deconstruct, which means that enemies that were hit by the Sentinel have a chance of dropping health orbs, which in turn with Equilibrium mean energy orbs for your Warframe. I personally also like to add the mod crowd dispersion, which is another skill for Worm, which counts towards the increased health orb drop rate from synth deconstruct, so you're gonna be good with energy all the time basically. As I showed earlier, I added just a couple of elemental mods to the Volcax weapon for the priming, it doesn't really matter which ones you use. And to finally round up the whole energy sustain and make sure that we never ever run out of energy, we infuse Grendel's skill Nourish onto our first skill slot, which not only gives us crazy energy regeneration, but also added viral damage to all our attacks, which is gonna make us even stronger than we have been before. And this would be it for survivability and energy sustain. So let's go and finally finish up the rest of the build. Since we want to get to the 95% damage reduction on her 3 and also get more damage out of her Nourish and more damage out of her Regulators, what we're looking for is of course ability strength, going with Umbral Intensify and Blind Rage, since we really don't care about our energy that much. And in our final slot, we're gonna use Prime Continuity to give us more ability duration, meaning all of this down here is gonna stay on for longer. Let's also quickly go over and finish up the build for our Worm, where we pretty much go and add a little bit of convenience like primed regen so he doesn't stay dead for so long, vacuum so he can pick up stuff, and the last mod slot is pretty much up to your personal preference. You could add another bond mod, you could go and add enemy radar, it doesn't matter. With the initial setup being done, this build can now take on pretty much any enemy in the entire game, no matter how high the level. And if you now want to know about all the other broken stuff that the new Melee Arcanes and Archon shards have to offer, then you must check out this one next. Another massive thank you to Akimbo Fate, Niels V, Lemies, Demon Lord Zell, Bland Waffle, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Ross Camise, Nost Linux Gaming, Archaic Lycan, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other next year, and until then, as always, good loot.